How's it going, guys? My name's Graham and welcome to Two Left Thumbs. Here I am with a video I said I would never make. But same as last time when I did Ellie's backstory, I was struck with inspiration and the whole video went from concept to script to video in only a day or two. I love when that happens. Something else that's been a long time coming, the Kickstarter for Scrabdackle is live today. I'm just very eager to share that information. I'll remind you in more detail later on. Ellie's backstory was a lot of fun to flesh out, working off of those minuscule details. A quick add-on to that video, I posed the idea of her own top-at rivals being the Punkhauser biker gang, and someone in the comments built on that as being a perfect explanation of why she is so skilled and comfortable on a bike. I'm kicking myself for not thinking of that. It makes too much sense. I mean, Puffballs basically deconfirmed everything in that theory, but that's fine. These videos are simply for fun and an avenue for fans to speculate more themselves. Maybe provide a headcanon for these characters and their otherwise mysterious backstories. Sorry, I just had to get that out of the way. I had so many people ask me to do a similar video on Charles. I usually joked around with them saying his backstory is that he's a nice flyboy, and things like that. I really didn't see anything in the game that indicated a richer backstory than that. I had taken a stab at it, couldn't paint a larger picture, and figured I'd move on from the idea. But it didn't sit quite right with me to have videos so dedicated to the other two main characters and not round out this main trio. So it stuck in the back of my mind, and all at once the ideas came flooding. Let's give this a shot, as long as we're all willing to accept that Puff probably doesn't have a real backstory in mind, so it's not like he was leaving hints specifically, and anything I suggest here is fan-made speculation and just for fun. I also maybe have less to go off of here than I did last time. Ellie's story is laced with loose threads and possible hints at more, while Charles appears to simply be, well, a nice flyboy. But I had some fun with it and think I came up with something satisfactory. Let's start with his personality profile. Charles is quick to make friends. If maybe a little socially awkward, he tends to ramble and stumble on his words. He possesses a carefree attitude that I think anyone would envy, being completely unfazed by even the most dire circumstances. This calm, collected demeanor, despite his seemingly unfocused and often silly nature, is likely what allowed him to earn his place as a go-to ace pilot for the government. His skill set seems to be rather limited. Almost anything he tries to do to assist Henry doesn't work as intended, unless it requires his precise piloting skills. He's constantly pulling off daring feats and unbelievable stunts. This reliability is what has made Charles an asset to the government, rather than the liability he can sometimes be for Henry. Charles is insanely loyal. He's willing to see past Henry's character flaws and crimes, and by proxy, is willing to trust and accept anyone Henry is close to. This extends well beyond politeness, to the point that he would lay down his life for Henry despite the limited time they've known one another. He is also rather musically inclined. That runs so deep in his character that he even has a dedicated song that allows him to be summoned like Epona. I'll expand on his musical qualities a little later on. A brief special mid-video announcement: the Kickstarter for Scrabdackle is live today. It is a non-linear action-adventure game about a wizard's first adventure. If you love lore, a huge mechanic in that game is scribing things around the world. NPCs, enemies, bosses, landmarks, regions, hundreds of different things to populate your notebook with. As if the rest of that game isn't going to be so fun, if you love spinning your own theories like this video, then a game like Scrabdackle is going to have huge appeal to you. I'll have a link in the description and a pinned comment. I'll remind you at the end of the video. Charles's infiltrating the airship bio indicates that he is one of the youngest and most experienced pilots. It reads like an oxymoron, but what this indicates to me is that he likely joined the government as early as he could, which would be the age of 18. We know that Henry is 28 years old and can assume that they're near the same age. I did some quick research, and from what I've found, it usually takes about 18 months to go from a fighter pilot in training to sitting in a real fighter cockpit. It takes another 2 years to be considered a threat, and usually about 10 years to be a real master pilot. That would place Charles at 28 years years old as well. But if that is the average career track for an experienced fighter pilot, and Charles is notably young and experienced, then Charles is either a little younger than Henry and excelling for his age, or he actually started earlier than 18 years old, and despite being 28, is experienced well beyond those years. I don't think it's anything as crazy as Charles lying about his age to join the military before he was 18. I mean, look at this guy. He's not gonna lie to anyone. Instead, I believe Charles came from a family with a military background. Hubert Galeforce has a chummy relationship with Charles, being the only character to call him Charlie.
Now you and Charlie have worked well together in the past, so we figured you'd be the perfect man for this operation.
Showing there is some familiarity there. Galeforce is someone who has known Charles for a long time, probably working alongside at least one of his parents. This parent was likely also a pilot, maybe both of them, which would have been his early introduction to that as a career option. Maybe it had been observed at a young age that Charlie had an aptitude for all things aeronautic. Charles, his parents, and Galeforce could have been operating outside of usual government protocol, and fostered this early interest in piloting off the books. We know Charles as a bit of a goofball, and if he's this distracted grown up, he potentially wasn't the strongest student in school. Instead, those around him nurtured this interest of his instead, taking him around Air Force bases and showing him different aircrafts. Maybe he had time in a military-grade flight simulator. Traditional education wasn't going to be a good fit for Charles, so why not start him on something else young? In this way, he could be the youngest and the most experienced. Now with the youthful confidence mixed with the expertise of someone who's been flying much longer. That would obviously make him an asset.
Yeah, if I could take what I know now, put it in the body I had 10 years ago, that would be someone I wouldn't want to fight.
When it comes time for Galeforce to organize the raid on the Top-Ats, Charles is his obvious choice. Someone who has been like a son to him for many years, who has the expertise, will likely not be in the line of fire, as he's obviously protective of Charles, and someone who he recognizes is likely to be able to work well with their risky new recruit, Henry. The age would help, but their profile of Henry would be a quiet, unpredictable criminal. How do you balance that out? With the talkative, reliable, talented young military operative. That type of foil in personality types is the sort of thing the entire buddy cop genre is based off of. That partnership, if not every other aspect of the mission, is incredibly successful, but an unintended outcome of this is just how good a pair Henry and Charles make. Galeforce wanted them to work well together, but maybe didn't appreciate that closeness of their bond and immediate trust that would then form. In fleeing the complex, it is stated that Charles literally abandoned an active mission to help Henry. Again, we have that loyalty on display to a fault. Charles is the ultimate wingman. While Ellie had more of an identical life history to Henry with all the criminal activity and other character flaws, Charles in most ways is the opposite of Henry. We have two characters in perfect sync, and two working as exact opposites. You could think of it like a good path only Henry, making the opposite decisions and representing maybe what Henry could have achieved. Charles has no literal superpowers or a magic repository of endless items, but is proficient in many places Henry is not. He is organized, tactical, and lawful. Skills that'll come in handy in many situations Henry would otherwise be hindered. In relationships, opposites attract, and in a partnership like theirs, they completely complement one another. Henry and Ellie have a very obvious kinship, being cut from the same cloth. In a very different way, Charles and Henry are connected. We specifically see that Charles and Ellie get along, but do not communicate as effectively as Henry does with either of them. Really, that's what makes Henry the main protagonist. He's the glue that brings this team together, being able to have a foot in each world, operating directly within the law that morning, then sleazing it up with other criminals later that same afternoon. Lots of people asked in that Ellie video if her and Henry have parallel lives, who is her Charles? And I don't think she has one. Even though her life history so directly overlaps Henry's, there is no reason someone else would have an equivalent life to Charles for her. Ellie and Henry are these two kindred spirits. The two individually in their lives are the same. That doesn't mean that someone else in her life would incidentally rise to that role. Henry is still the main character here, with Ellie and Charles both being counterparts to Henry. And through that, Charles is in some way Ellie's Charles, and Ellie is Charles's Ellie. I don't think it needs to be more layered or complex than that, even though that statement is overly complex. But if you really want to pick at that thread and tie in some deeper lore, then I think my pitch would be that Ellie's Charles is in fact Bert Curtis. He is a character specifically seen in completing the mission working for the Toppats. They speak in a slow, monotone manner and always wear over-ear headphones, the kind worn in helicopters, even when he isn't in a helicopter, much like a certain someone. He's still a pilot, a bit of a goof with comics plastered on his wall, yet chose a life of crime over lawful government work. Their attitude and rambly dialogue are certainly in line with that of the Charles we know and love, even if their moral compass is spun in the wrong direction. Perhaps there was an alternate path for that character, where they were strictly good like Charles. I still prefer to think that Charles is some independent character, that there's not some doppelganger out there existing in Ellie's side of the story, but if that's how you prefer to view it, then I think Bert Curtis is your guy. Charles appears to bring out the best in Henry, often pushing him towards making the more selfless choices and more closely operating within the law. At the same time, Henry appears to be a negative influence on Charles, with him breaking protocol to help at the wall. There are a few dots that can be connected here in this picture I've painted. Charles is close with Gale Force, and talented beyond his years as a pilot because he was raised in a military family. If that's the case, then where are his parents? I'm speculating that at least one of them was a pilot, and it's my suspicion that they were both killed in action. And from that point on, Gale Force has very much been Charles's father figure, someone who's been close to him his whole life, who has been there through bad times and good. If his parents were out flying missions, or more likely, in an effort to separate out training from parenthood so that his extracurriculars didn't affect his relationship with his parents, Gale Force likely would have filled the role of teacher. In one-on-one training sessions, that would lead to a very strong bond. Being raised in the rigors of military discipline has made Charles very skilled, but may have also robbed him of having close friends and a more normal adolescence. His social circle is small, and as soon as his parents were gone, General Gale Force was one of the only ones around who could look after him. All he really has is the military. That's why Charles breaking rank to help Henry is such abnormal behavior. Why would Charles willfully be helping this criminal? It could be read as rebellious behavior against his stoic father figure, but I'm guessing at this age Charles is well beyond that. I think it is instead that Charles and Henry have a friendship and bond that may be a relatively new experience for him. Certainly, he would have had friends while training as a pilot, but assuming he was always ahead of the curve, with his background granting him a leg up, other students may not have gotten along with him easily, instead always competing with him and lagging behind. It wouldn't help that perception if he was always the youngest of his classmates, outperforming many who had been piloting longer. Either he'd train alongside those the same age and continuously outperform them, or if he was bumped ahead, he'd be the young punk kid showing up all the veterans. All of this is so potentially isolating from both his peers of his skill level he was likely training beside, and those his age who he would normally hang out with in the off time. That obviously would have hurt Charles's socialization skills, and may have led to him being a bit rambly when interacting with others. Helicopter banter is some of the only chatting he gets to do. Charles doesn't have a specific theme song the way Ellie does. His identity is so closely linked to that of the government and the military that themes specifically tied to them are used for Charles' scenes and moments instead. But as stated before, he is a rather musical character. It's a little surprising he doesn't have a theme. Yet in a small way, he provided his own theme.
This is the greatest plan. This is the greatest plan.
This is Charles's way of staking out an identity for himself outside of his career. Everything else about him is defined through a lens of the military. Henry immediately understands and appreciates Charles beyond his pilot skills, and is able to even summon him using Charles's song, which sounds like a rendition of his own self-proclaimed theme. This shows both an attentiveness from Henry, intuiting who Charles is as a person, and the closeness of their friendship, as Henry is a typically self-involved character. It also firmly places Charles in that sidekick territory, as someone who largely places his value in the context of being able to assist Henry. a position he seems more than happy to be in. Second in command is a big step up from following orders in the military, and a baby step towards leading the charge himself. When he teams back up with Henry after presumed dead, the Toppats have launched their orbital station and have been raiding all over the planet. Charles specifically states that it's starting to
get personal.
There is very little Charles is shown to care about. The list is essentially his friends, others close to him, piloting, and possibly music. The fact that this storyline begins with Charles grounded and fighting hand-to-hand, something we've never seen him do otherwise, I imagine that in his latest attempt to stop the Toppats, they shot down and destroyed his helicopter. For him, that'd be pretty personal. Being introduced to various aircraft and helicopters at a young age, excelling with each, and having such close ties to high-ranking government officials meant that Charles was the perfect candidate to train at a higher level for experimental technologies. So it makes perfect sense that he is able to pilot spacecraft when completing the mission comes around. Now, we obviously have to talk about the plan. The greatest plan. Where does this come from? Why would Charles have this as something in his head that he has always wanted to do? And attempting to do it 3 times in just a few short missions? How is it not something he had attempted prior to this? He's been a pilot a long time. If this is his go-to plan, how had he never done it yet? Hold on, because this is about to get a little emotional. I mentioned that Charles's parents would have been killed in action. Think of Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne from Ant-Man, a couple going on dangerous missions together. Regardless of who was in the air and who was on foot, or if they were both pilots, Charles's parents were partners in love and duty, which would be a tagline for a great movie. While I imagine they would both be military, whereas Charles and Henry have more of a good-bad pairing, in either scenario, they perfectly complement each other's skill sets while on missions together. On a risky mission of their own, Charles's parents' only option became to crash the chopper. In the moment, it wouldn't have been a harebrained or suicidal move. It was a last resort, but something necessary for the greater good, and a maneuver that is hailed as being expertly executed, much like Charles's eventual success. These were talented pilots at their peak. After this calculated crash, the two would have attempted to escape, but were trapped and lost in the fallout of their brave sacrifice. I'm drawing a lot on pop culture, but I think of the relationship Captain Kirk had with his own father in Star Trek. Growing up hearing the story of his father's sacrifice to save countless lives, thus motivating Kirk to take a similar path in life. Charles grew up surrounded by these stories, a bit of a loner, and in the shadow of the valiant efforts of his parents, fully aware of their daring plan they executed together. Gale Force would have given it to him straight, explained what they did, how and why, hoping it would make Charles a better pilot, one maybe less likely to take risks, and someone who could survive against any odds.
Your father was captain of a starship for 12 minutes.
He saved 800 lives, including yours.
I dare you to do better.
Charles shares with Henry and Ellie that the cannon on his helicopter was fitted as a cannon specifically built to fire human beings. This could have been a piece of technology built in response to his parents' heroic efforts, creating a means to deploy operatives without needing to perform anything as risky as directly dive bombing their own chopper. Without anyone being this personally close to Charles in his decade or more in the military, he's never seen the need for anything this dramatic. And since he's usually the one taking orders, he was never given the opportunity to pitch a plan of his own. He's lacking that autonomy, and the personal connection for such a sacrifice hasn't been present. How could someone be motivated to risk everything when they don't feel they have anyone specific in mind to save? His new friendship with Henry is something he has unknowingly wanted his whole life, and it provides him with a feeling of closeness to his parents and places him in their shoes. When it counted most, his new friend's life was on the line, and he was faced with a dire circumstance that was much larger than the two of them. Their mission needed to succeed because there was no one else for the job. With Henry at his side, Charles steps up to execute the same bold action plan his parents utilized long ago. Successfully pulling off that maneuver is Charles fulfilling a lifelong legacy that has followed him ever since the loss of his parents through to joining the military and mastering his pilot school. He breathes a sigh of relief, excited to go home, feeling that personal achievement as he has now lived up to everything his superiors, and more importantly, parents knew he could be. potentially showing how big that legacy is, or instead building on the idea that Henry and Charles have more in common than it would originally appear. Henry attempts this plan for himself in the Top At King route. Maybe he's heard of this sacrifice as well. But this choice is especially significant because in the two routes necessary to lead into Top At King, which are rapidly promoted executive and convict allies, Henry barely interacts with Charles, and certainly wouldn't have seen or heard this plan from him at any point. You could say great minds think alike? Well, fools seldom differ. In any path, Charles is a lovable, noble friend and often makes mistakes, but his heroism is never in question. The Valiant hero path, while sad, is a perfect end to his life story. His selflessness, skills, and loyalty are put front and center, with his plans taking a leading role for the first time through this entire series. It was his idea to go to space, he encourages Henry to hide in the trash ball, he rams the spaceship, discovers the vent, and in the end holds off jacked Hugh-Man to allow Henry to escape. Having Charles act more as the protagonist for this one path does seem to indicate that this is a particularly meaningful storyline specifically for him. While all endings are canon and none can be read as more true or more important, if any of my fan theorizing is to be believed, then this one is at least the most personally and emotionally significant for this character, if not truly more or less canon in the context of all game endings. Charles is giving his life for a cause he believes in, to protect his closest friend, and on a much deeper level, to make his parents proud. I'm sorry to leave things on such a depressing note, but I think there is joy to be found there as well. That Charles found a friend as close as Henry, and in either life or death was able to find a purpose outside of what is otherwise really just a career. It's a positive thing to see him build a self-identity that extended beyond being a pilot, even if that remained an important part of his character. While he seemed happy to operate taking orders or working as a sidekick, as any military man is trained to do, Valiant Hero is the ending where he takes charge, becomes his own person, and does Henry, Gale Force, and the rest of us proud. I guess you can take solace in the fact that I'm just one fan theorizing, speculating, and filling in the blanks, rather than assembling much real content within the game. There's a lot more pulled out of thin air than there was in the Ellie video, but I hope that it somewhat rewrites how the Valiant Hero deniers view that ending. It's sad to lose one of our favorite characters. I mean, heck, Henry dies in one of the routes. But this is also the ultimate storyline that sends Charles off in the most meaningful way. As promised, I do want to say one more time, the Scrabdackle Kickstarter is live today. It'll be running for 1 month. The game is packed with story, hidden lore, secrets everywhere, as well as interesting forms of character progression, dramatic boss battles, loads of new spells to unlock, and a freedom of choice and exploration that leads to plenty of replayability. That initial goal is already going to result in such a wonderful, massive, expansive game, but if we go beyond that, there's already a list of stretch goals set, each of which have such exciting ways to expand the content in the game. I'm so excited to see if we can scratch off a bunch of those. In addition to your usual reward tiers, getting a copy of the game, a soundtrack, an art book, things like that, there are also creator add-ons. You can meaningfully contribute to this world, design background characters, create a boss fight. You could even create an entire region within the game. There is so much there in a game that already has so much to offer. This is a project I so strongly personally believe in. Please consider showing your support towards this Kickstarter campaign. Thank you so much for hearing me out. I truly think you'll enjoy it. You guys will have to let me know what you think. Maybe you found other details in the game that you either spawned your own headcanon from, or fun things that could be layered into this fictional backstory. Regardless, it would be fun to talk about. I feel very satisfied to have covered the 3 main characters at this point. It is very unlikely that I do a video like this for anyone else in the series. While we have a few other major-ish characters, none that we spend quite as much time with as these. I like the fact that these can sit as their own little trilogy. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you to Puff for making the Henry Stickmin series. Thank you to patrons of the channel for their support. And thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.